This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include a newcomer to our show, Rick Henderson, editor-in-chief of the Carolina Journal, former representative and former senator Leo Daughtry, one of our favorite journalists, Cash Michaels with the Winston-Salem Chronicle, and former Lieutenant Governor Dennis Wicker. John and Chris are away this week, by the way. We welcome you to our 983rd edition of NC Spin, our Labor Day edition. This week we ask our panel to discuss two Supreme Court hearings, one on the separation of powers and one on redistricting. We'll ask the panel to further talk about court changes and who picks our judges. And we'll ask why our state has so many jail deaths. Plus, as always, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. Last Monday, the North Carolina Supreme Court heard two cases that could have significant consequences. The first involved a lawsuit between Governor Cooper and the legislature over the law combining the State Ethics Commission with the State Board of Elections. The second dealt with the redistricting challenge facing North Carolina. We want our panel to discuss these. I want to ask Leo Daughtry, help us frame the arguments in this Cooper versus the legislature case. At first glance, it seems to be a separation of powers issue with the legislative branch taking power away from the executive branch. What are the arguments from both sides?
Well, first of all, in 2016, there were 5 members of the state board. The General Assembly amended the law to make it 8 members of the state board. 4 would be chosen from a list submitted by the Democrats and 4 chosen from a list submitted by the Republicans. And the governor would select those members. And at the local level, there were 3 in 2016.
Every county.
And now there are 4, 2 from the Republican Party and 2 from the Democrat Party. They call it the nonpartisan election. Governor Cooper says that's no more than putting lipstick on a pig. We've already been through that, and that is you're getting to my area of executive branch. The argument against that is that the governor selects those people. The General Assembly passed the bill originally, and now they're just amending the bill to make sure that there is a nonpartisan group on the board.
Okay, but Cash, is the argument really over whether or not the legislature has the authority to combine the Ethics Commission and the State Board of Elections, or whether the legislature has the authority to designate how many appointments governor gets to make to these boards?
Well, the argument, at least the governor's argument, seems to be you guys are encroaching on my territory. The Constitution says that I'm allowed to choose people who share my views and priorities, and you're choosing pretty much, you're making sure that I only choose from a select pool, and I don't particularly care for that. I'm not free to do what I'm supposed to do according to the Constitution.
Dennis, Governor Cooper says that the process could easily cause a deadlock. If you've got an equal balance between both parties, you could you easily have a deadlock there. How likely do you see that happening?
Well, it could. In the essence of full disclosure, my law firm represents the legislature in that lawsuit.
I did not know that, or I would have revealed it.
I was going to say I think the legislature's right. but you know, I do think that there's a chance of a deadlock. But I also see the wisdom of trying to split it 4 and 4. You know, I think what's getting lost in here, Tom, is there's no consideration for the policy question. It seems to be about politics. And I think that the politics are, you know, Governor Cooper says, I don't want you taking my executive branch powers away because I want to do my job. And the legislature saying, look, we've always had the power to revamp any state agency we want to, right, and dictate policy that way. So it's really going to be a hard question, I think, for the court to answer.
This thing's been going on since December of 2016, Rick, when the legislature passed this thing in special session. Came before the Supreme Court. Any indication when the judges might decide? I mean, we've got municipal elections coming up here in just a few weeks.
Well, right now, any disputes that come before the boards, the county boards that don't have a full quorum, have to go to the Court of Appeals. So, I mean, that's how how messed up the situation is right now, because the governor has chosen not to appoint anyone to the new state board because he doesn't want to concede any legal ground here. And yes, we're going to have municipal elections very soon, and it's quite possible that we will do so without a board of elections unless this decision comes down quickly.
Any indication when the Supremes might decide this one?
I think they will decide pretty quickly. They realize how serious this issue is, and I don't think they'll mess around and wait for a while. I think they'll go ahead and do it.
Now, the other argument that was being put forward last Monday during this discussion, legislative leaders asked the court to dismiss the appeal of a redistricting lawsuit, Dennis, saying those that who initiated had already gotten what they wanted, namely a ruling that the old maps were racially gerrymandered. The Supreme Court didn't do so. Why?
Well, I wish I could tell you why. I think that they are vexed by this question. It's a tough deal, and as you know, we got some things going on in the Fourth Circuit of North Carolina on the.
We're going to get to that in a minute.
Well, and then you got the Wisconsin case about
the
political
U.S. Supreme
gerrymandering.
Court. Yeah.
So there's just a lot of moving parts here, Tom, and I think it's going to be hard for the court to sort this out, to be quite honest.
Meanwhile, Cash, the legislature approved this past week the legislative districts for both the House and the Senate. One of the Senate districts was sort of unusual, but Democrats drew their own maps. Now, they're going to be submitted to that 3-judge federal panel that Dennis was alluding to. Democrats are saying the new maps aren't much better than the old ones, particularly not using race at all as a factor will violate the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What do you think the chances are the legislators' maps might be approved or might not be approved?
Well, it looks more and more like the 3-judge federal panel is going to look at this and then look at the attorneys for the Republican-led legislature and said, weren't you people listening? Imagine you have a car that's broken and you use a wrench to somehow screw it up, and then you come back.
The hammer usually works well for me.
Okay. And then, but you don't use the same tools to fix it. And that's essentially what the Democrats are saying. How can you possibly use race to break our redistricting model, but then not use race to fix it?
Yeah.
And the problem is still there. And so I have the funniest feeling that particularly Judge James Wynn, who is part of that 3-judge federal panel, he's going to look at this and say, you're really kidding me. You took all this time to come back with this? Watch what happens.
So what could happen there? The judges could conceivably draw the districts, or
Well, that's what I was going. That's where I was going, Tom. I actually think that the court is going to try to wait for the Wisconsin case to come down to get the Supreme Court to rule on that. The Supreme Court of the United States.
has it even been heard yet? I
No,
thought
I don't think it's been heard.
In October.
It's in October when it's going to be
It's going to be
heard.
argued in October. But I think they'll wait for that because it'll probably come out before the end of the year.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the Fourth Circuit's going to look at that, and they're deciding whether or not, I think they'll decide whether or not they draw the maps themselves. I think they are going to end up drawing the maps themselves.
But isn't that going to be, we have the 2018 midterms coming up. Can they wait that long?
Well,
The
State Board of-
filing's
No,
not
no.
due to start until February or so.
The State Board of Elections says as long as they've got maps in place by February when filing starts, then they'll be able to do everything on schedule.
Yeah. Another event happened last week, which was sort of unusual. A separate panel of 4 federal judges was asked to dismiss the lawsuit over congressional districts. You remember when the districts were drawn in 2011, they were declared unconstitutional for racial gerrymandering. The legislature came back in 2016 and drew new congressional maps. In fact, we held those, used those maps for our elections last year. The legislature said, hey, let's dismiss this case, particularly since we've got this business going on. We've drawn new maps. That Fourth Circuit Court refused to do it. Tell me why.
Well, don't know. I don't know. The Fourth Circuit has a real difficult time with our General Assembly. Every time we send a case up there, they lose. Our General Assembly loses. And as you say, Judge Wynn is right there in the middle of it. I think in the idea of redistricting, when I was involved, we were required to draw as many minority-majority districts as we could.
Right.
and then send those up to get approval, pre-approval. And then now they're saying, well, you can't do that. You can't put everybody in a minority, all the minorities together. You got to spread them out.
Well, Leo, you got to admit, y'all went crazy with some of that. I mean,
Well, we were
it was being-
they were
it was
all
being-
approved.
There's a difference between having a majority minority district and one which the majority of the minority is crammed into one district.
But if you say it's a 35% minority district, you're likely to have a white person elected.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you got to have more than that. You needed at
the
least
Voting
40.
Rights Act says they have to have the opportunity to be able
That's
to elect.
right.
All right, just changing subjects just a little bit, Rick. The lawmakers met in special session earlier this week when, as we said, they approved the new legislative districts. But there was also on the agenda overriding some of Governor Cooper's vetoes. They kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off, and there's some speculation they didn't have the votes. Is that what happened?
There were a lot of members who were not there, or at least a significant number who probably had employment issues, they had vacations scheduled, they weren't planning on being around here at the end of August, and you had some very tight margins in some of these, especially in the House. And so they were not going to bring up the veto override unless they actually had the votes in hand. And I think that was part of the issue, is that something when Tom Tillis was Speaker of the House, he had what he called the pocket veto,
right,
where he would threaten to bring up a bill for a veto override whenever he had the votes.
Had that, haven't they?
They absolutely have. You got a couple of former majority leaders on this panel. You don't pull that trigger until the votes are on the floor.
That's right, and I think that's the case. That there were a number. In some cases, the House was about 10 to 12 members down in some of these votes, and so that may have been the situation.
You've got to learn to count pretty quickly.
Here's a reminder to viewers in the Raleigh-Durham market. This is the last week WRAL is going to air NC Spin. Beginning next week, you'll find us at the same time, but on a new station. Starting next Sunday, look for NC Spin on Fox 50, WRAZ in the Raleigh market, both at 6:30 a.m. and again at 8:30 a.m. And you can always video stream our program by visiting our website at ncspin.com. Get more balanced debate for the Old North State on NC Spin. When we come back, judicial reform.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
The healthcare landscape is filled with questions and uncertainties of changes that are coming. In these times of change, there's one thing you can trust. You can trust your family physician to work for you, not only in treating sickness and disease, but also your overall health. Regardless of how healthcare might change, the men and women of the North Carolina Academy of Family Physicians pledge to work upholding your trust. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisors.
I hear it all the time. Rising health care costs are squeezing North Carolina families. Deductibles continue to climb, prescription drug prices are skyrocketing, medical bills are unknown until they arrive in the mail, and premiums are increasing by double digits. This is decimating family budgets. We should be focused on education and jobs, not EpiPen cost and medical bill errors. We need quality, affordable, and transparent health care for our families.
We now return to NC Spin.
Former Court of Appeals Judge Doug McCullough was just shy of the mandatory retirement age of 72 last year when he received a call from the head of the North Carolina Republican Party. It was suggested in that call that he step down early, prior to a Democrat taking the governor's office. By leaving early, Governor Pat McCrory could then appoint a judge to serve the remainder of his term. But in considering the request, McCullough said he came to believe that the intention was not just to put a Republican on the court, but so that lawmakers could put their Republican on the court. Cash Michaels and Dennis Wicker, I want to ask both of you to give us your reaction to Judge McCullough's comments. Cash, I'll start with you.
I think Judge McCullough was thinking in terms of legacy, that if he was going to leave the court, that he was not going to leave this kind of baggage, that he was doing the legislative Republicans' dirty work for them, so to speak. He also brought up the fact when he left that when Governor Martin, one of our few Republican recent governors, was in office, that the Democrats who were in charge of the legislature did not pull that on him. They left him alone with his judges, let him choose whatever he wanted to, and what have you. McCullough did not want to have that left, I left early to make
Plus,
sure.
he said
that
he had cases that he needed to get finished up, and it would have harmed his retirement benefits also. Dennis, what's your take on
Well,
this?
I think Judge McCullough made the right decision to stay on. I will tell you, I think he was thinking about the public's trust. Now, think about this. The public hadn't had much trust for the legislative branch or the executive branch of government. The one they do have trust in is the judicial branch of government. And I think he foresaw the things that could happen politically if these kinds of games started, and he just didn't want to start playing those games.
Leo, let's just assume that Judge McCullough's assertion is correct and the legislature did indeed want to pick the next Court of Appeals judge. It really opens up the question as to who should select our judges. We've debated this topic a lot of times on NC Spin, but nothing has happened to change the process of allowing the voters to select the judges. Is it time to change that selection process?
In my opinion, it is past time. As a matter of fact, it's hard for a judge to be a politician. There's a great judge named Leonard Hand who said, a good judge is a poor politician, and a bad judge is a good politician. And you've got to have somebody willing to run and raise the money, and that doesn't give us a real good smell test.
And Rick, the thing about it is, I mean, over and over and over again, you talk to people on election day and they say, I don't know the names of these judges. I don't know who I'm voting for here. But the other side of that is they don't want to give up their right to vote. Is justice really being served? Why do we continue to hold elections when few people really know anything about who they're voting for?
One of the issues is that judges really are not expected to let you know what they think about the issues, because there are various judicial canons that attorneys and judicial candidates have to follow, in which they really can't and should not let you or telegraph how they're going to vote on a particular case. So if you don't know where they stand on the issues, or they can't really tell you very much, then it is hard to know what judges believe in. And so we have a system now in which most, if not all, of judges are now going to be elected under partisan labels. That gives some information. But as Leo says, a superior system.
Okay, let's dissect that.
Okay.
I don't want a Republican judge. I don't want a Democratic judge. I want a jurist who can consider the law and the Constitution and rule independently, don't you?
Tom, I used to be for partisan elections when it was mostly a Democrat state. I realize now it's wrong. The problem we're going to have with the politicization of the judicial branch and with partisan races and things of that nature is when it's being fueled by money, it's going to cause a real problem in terms of the public's trust of the judicial branch. I think probably people's biggest fear is going before a judge that's been financed by a group of people to make a decision.
And have them opposing you in court.
Absolutely.
Leo, during the past legislative session, there were several new laws passed regarding the courts. They reduced the number of Court of Appeal judges. They decreased the number of emergency judges by 70%, which is a huge number. Required the judicial candidates to identify their political affiliation, cut funding to legal aid organizations. The North Carolina Constitution, of which I know you have read and studied quite a bit, says that the General Assembly shall have no power to deprive the judicial department of any power or jurisdiction that rightfully pertains to it as a coordinate department of the government. Do these laws violate that Constitution?
It certainly could. I really believe of the three branches of government, the most important one is the judiciary. Our country, we've never had someone come in your house at night when you had to sleep and be worried about being taken out. The courts have protected us, and it's time for us to review as justice, as the Chief Justice is doing now, review a way to have retention elections or some way to make sure that judges can be independent and not subject to powers.
It seems like we're going back the other way. Cash, while we're on the subject of judicial matters, Representative Justin Burr, who seems to have a burr under his saddle, dropped a bill in the legislature late in the session that surprised everybody. HB 717 would reconfigure the judicial districts within the state. Didn't pass before adjournment. There's some belief that it might be up again in October in another special legislative session. What's your take on this bill?
I can tell you, in speaking to a number of lawmakers, particularly out west, that they are frightened of that bill. They see it as an overreach. They see no reason for it. They see it as an extension of what was done with legislative redistricting, and they're really just frightened.
It goes back to Article 4 of the Constitution to a certain extent, interfering with the department.
They're not pleased.
Yeah, well, and a lot of district attorneys and judges are not happy.
No,
with
it's going to create upheaval in the court system and across North Carolina. But I would say that anything of that nature, redistricting, should come from the judicial branch itself as a recommendation to the General Assembly.
Well, and at the very least, it ought to be done in a long session
sure.
when there can be plenty of debate and discussion about it. That was my column this week, by the way. I urge you to read it. When we come back after these messages, we're going to talk about deaths in jail.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
North Carolina General Assembly recently gave state retirees a well-deserved cost of living increase. Now local governments across North Carolina need to follow the legislature's lead and include retiree cost of living increases in their budgets. These increases are long overdue and desperately needed by all our retirees. The legislature heard us, and they did what's right. It's time for local governments to do the same. Learn more at ncrgea.com.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, come on, we're leaving.
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
A series in a local newspaper reported that over the past 5 years, there have been 150 inmates who died while in jail. The stories pointed the blame to the lack of adequate supervision in our 113 local jails and suggested more was needed in order to keep inmates safe. Rick Henderson, jail suicides account for about 50% of those inmate deaths, higher than the national average, and in many cases, these inmates had mental illness or drug problems. What's your reaction to the problem of inmate deaths?
It's really appalling how it took place and how many of them took place without adequate supervision. Because what the series discovered was that while you're supposed to check inmates at least twice an hour, and if there are mental illness cases or there are cases of substance abuse every 15 minutes, in some cases in these suicides, some of these inmates weren't checked for hours.
Is this a problem, Cash, of not having enough people, or that the supervisors aren't doing their job?
I think a little bit of both, but also I think that training or lack thereof is key here.
And one way or another, Leo, it looks to me like more money is going to be needed here.
There's no question about it. We do not pay those kind of people, those guards who guard medium security prisoners, enough money, and we sort of push them away from our minds.
Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger says he wants a study on this. What's the study going to find? I mean, too many are dying in jail.
Well, yeah, I think that's what the result will be, but I also hope, and I'm glad that Senator Berger's taking charge of the issue.
Yeah. Well, yes.
And I think what they're going to have to do, Tom, is they're going to have to put more of these inmates into treatment or give them something other than just drugs and
all of our mental health hospitals.
That's
you can't lock them up and throw away the key.
And I hope he can bring back some reforms that we need.
Yeah. When we come back, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau. The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
One of the best parts of the show is when we ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. And this is the time. Dennis Wicker, we'll start with you.
When a prisoner shows up at prison, they usually have substance abuse problems. We need to get them treatment while they're in prison or they'll go back to their same old habits. And here's what you don't know. It's cheaper to treat them in jail and in prison than it is for them to sit there and do nothing.
Really? That's an interesting point. Cash Michaels, tell us something we don't know.
74th Annual North Carolina NAACP Convention will take place at the Raleigh Convention Center August 5th through the 7th. It'll be the last convention that...
Wait a minute, August 5th or September?
I checked that, October 5th through the 7th. Bishop William Barber, the president of the NAACP, this will be the last one he will preside over. They will be electing new leadership. Two candidates will be Reverend Dr. T. Anthony Spearman of Greensboro and also Reverend Dr. Portia Rochelle of Raleigh.
Leo Daughtry, tell us something we don't know.
I'll tell you something we do know, but we forget. We have the greatest university system in the world. We have 240,000 children in school and 50,000 employees, and they do an outstanding job.
That's a good point. It's good to hear something positive. Rick Henderson, tell us something we don't know.
Another positive note, speaking of the universities, 2 more UNC campuses just got a green light from the organization called the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which covers civil liberties on campus. North Carolina has 8 schools with green lights out of 33.
That's about the most of any state, isn't
By
it?
far, the most of any state.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback, and read my weekly column, visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. Hope you have a nice Labor Day weekend and join us next week. By the way, remember, in Raleigh-Durham, we move over to Fox 50. We'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Join us next week and get the spin on issues facing our state.